Hi everyone, this is Eric aka Justice Blinded, and we are going to do a video today about sealed deck selection. We're going to talk specifically about how to evaluate decks, or at least some ideas I have as to how to evaluate decks that are most commonly come up in sealed deck selection, but they can be applied in different places. So I want to go over some concepts first, then we'll pop open some decks and off the Master Vault. We'll open some decks off the Master Vault and try to make some rapid evaluations of them. So this should really be called sealed. So these are the sort of things that I would look for if I was playing in a Vault Tour event, that one of those sealed events where they give you 3 decks and you have to pick one. You have 15 minutes or whatever. You have to pick one and determine what it is that you are looking for and determine what you want to play. So here's what I look for when I'm evaluating decks, and hopefully this will help some people who have less experience doing that but are maybe going to Gen Con or any of the other sealed Vault tours in the future, or just a sealed event at LGS. So the first thing I look for when I'm looking at decks is Amber Control. And by Amber Control, I mean cards um, which prevent your opponent from gaining Amber, which decrease their Amber, which capture their Amber, which steal their Amber. Anything that messes with the Amber of the opponent. And I have some bullet points here. I'll kind of talk through them, but this is just basically kind of what to think about. Ideally, you want Amber Control in all 3 houses, and the reason why I say that is because what you don't want to have happen is you don't want to be forced into a situation where you're playing a deck and you're in a game and all your Amber Controls in like one house, let's say. Then if you are in a position where you have a couple pieces of that on board that can do some things where it takes the opponent off check, or some Amber Control things, you have one card in hand where there's Amber Control on the card, but you really otherwise would want to call a different house. So you have one piece of Amber Control and Shadows in your hand, but you have 5 Sanctum cards in your hand, and none of the Sanctum cards are Amber Control. You really probably want to call Sanctum a lot of the time there, but if you're forced into a decision where you have to make maybe suboptimal choices, and choose Shadows just to take someone off a key, that in the long run restricts your options. It limits the ceiling on your deck. It limits your ability to go very far. So you ideally want to see Amber Control in all 3 houses. And I'll pause for a moment here and say these considerations are all considerations. They're both considerations in concept and in the real world. Like, I'm going to talk about things that you want to see, but the reality is most of the time you're not going to get all of these things in a deck. And if you do, you're just extremely lucky. But usually you won't be that lucky. So when we talk about Amber Control, the second thing I put down was that resilient to counterplays. What does that mean? So there's some Amber Control that is immune to counterplays. A counterplay being what your opponent's going to do the turn after you do the thing with Amber Control, right? So if you played Burn the Stockpile is a great example. Burn the Stockpile is immune to counterplays. And by that I mean it's not capturing the Amber in a place where the opponent can kill a creature and get it back. It's not even stealing the Amber and they can steal it back. It is literally just lighting their Amber on fire. That's the point of the card. Burn the Stockpile. So they can't counterplay around that. So if all Amber Control is put in a pool and you could only pick some of it, you would first pick the things that were the most resilient to counterplays. The most swingy, perhaps, but resilient to counterplays. So Destruction of Amber is pretty resilient, is completely resilient. Steal is pretty resilient. Capture is probably the least resilient, because capture involves something that they will target and can kill and get it back. But still, capture way better than nothing. So especially in AoA. We're going to talk a lot about AoA because AoA is the current set, and that's what's going to be played a lot in the Vault Tours for all the sealed events for the near future. I put here, this may sound obvious, but it's an important consideration. Reliably taking people off check is the best way to win. So when I say something like that, um, uh, it's important to remember, and I'm trying to pull up a picture at the same time I'm doing this, but it's important to remember that you want to make sure that your opponent is taken off check. It's not just a matter of generally controlling, and that's why there are certain cards that are not as good as other cards in terms of amber control. So one of those examples is cards which do technically control amber, but they're not very good in terms of they're not very good in terms of sorry they're not very good in terms of preventing them from forging. So I'm trying to find. I apologize. I'm trying to find the image. This is excellent. Um, it's excellent TV for sure. All right, it's not coming up. I apologize. So we'll try to fix this in post. Um, I'm trying to put up a picture of Cutthroat Research. Cutthroat Research is an excellent example of something that is technically amber control, but is not an amazing card. So let me pull up Cutthroat Research. I apologize. I'll get it a different way. I was going to go one way, but so let me just do this. So here's Cutthroat Research, right? Cutthroat Research is a logos action. It says play steal 2 if your opponent has 8 or more. That's literally all it does. It has an amber staple to it, so you always get the amber. But it says steal 2 if your opponent has 8 or more. This is, in many situations, not excellent amber control. And the reason why is that in the absence of things that change key cost, the normal cost of forging a key is 6. So if your opponent has 8 and you can steal 2, this doesn't take them off check. And in AOA, there's not a whole lot of amber control, almost none in Logos other than this card. And then, of course, if you count things like having a helper bot to shift into a different house to get amber control, or if you have something like a legacy effervescent principle, which is very uncommon. So this card is an illusory amber control, if I'm saying that correctly. It doesn't really do what you want it to do. It's still better than nothing if you have to take amber away from them, but be aware of that. Something like interdimensional graft is not necessarily control, but it can be better. So let's go back to the documents. When I'm talking about amber control, and the other thing that you need to remember is that, especially in AOA, there's a lot of reap hate, right? There are creatures that say if the creature reaps, there's a creature that says if either player reaps with a creature, after a creature reaps, stun it. After a creature reaps, its owner must sacrifice it. The universal reap hate. Those things are significantly worse than one-sided reap hate. One-sided reap hate are things like Shockworm in Mars that says if an enemy creature reaps, stun it. That's way better because you're going to be in a lot of positions in sealed matches where you have a board advantage, but if you have that creature in play and you don't have a way to kill it, you're dramatically hampering your ability to play the game because you are having to stun all of your creatures, and that's not good. So you don't want to have that sort of situation where you only have one-sided, where you have both-sided reap hate, but you're the only one that's trying to reap. That's disastrous sometimes. So be aware that reap hate comes in 2 flavors, and one is significantly worse than the other. So the first thing I would look for in any deck is amber control. If you don't have amber control, you're going to be in a very bad situation unless you have a very specific rush deck, combo deck, and you don't run into any matchups where people are stealing your amber or taking your amber. It can get very nasty. You really have to have amber control. The second consideration is creature or board control, right? So you want to have things that take stuff off their board or hamper their board. And I said board wipes, try not to leave home without one, because in this format especially, you're going to want to be able to just take there are going to be a lot of decks that have heavy Brobnar, Sanctum. I mean, my sealed deck in Origins was Brobnar, Sanctum, Mars. It had lots of beef, right? It had lots of stuff that presents a major threat, and you want a creature removal thing, something like Unlock Gateway, or you wanted something like um, even the Spirit's Way, destroy all creatures 3 or higher, is usually a pretty good board wipe in this set. Coward's End is still here. Save the Pack is actually a pretty good board wipe in conjunction with other Untamed cards that put damage on things. Cards like They're Everywhere plus Save the Pack, that does a lot of work in terms of destroying creatures. And then I said, or maybe Beef, right? So if you don't have a board wipe, and you may not have a board wipe, or you may have a deck that doesn't have a board wipe, but you know that's the deck you're going to play, you can also have just a heavy creature setup, right? You can have creatures where you just have like a couple Lollops, you have a Gauntlet of Command, you just have stuff that can fight into other things. And sometimes it's obviously not a board wipe, but it can be just as good in certain matchups. So sometimes you're not going to get a board wipe, but you just got to deal with what you got. And then in terms of creature board control, I put other miscellaneous things like Tesmal, which is a disc creature. It says Reap, basically control the weak. Like Reap, pick a house, they can't choose that house next turn. Everything Brobnar that kind of falls into the 2B, like just have all the Brobnar stuff, be able to wreck them off the board, and so you have answers. Direct damage cards are also very, very, very good because there are a lot of taunty things in this set. And so it's very common for them to put something like an Ember Imp or a Tesmal or something something that's 2 power that you need dead, that needs to die, it needs to be killed, but it's sitting behind a taunt thing. So in that situation, direct damage cards are extremely important, or even if you can't get direct damage, sometimes stunning the creature for a turn or two is still good. It's still good enough in that situation. The third consideration I'll look for is number of creatures, right? So if there are a lot of creatures in the deck, it's usually better to have more creatures than fewer creatures. If you go below like 15, 14, even if your deck is very good, unless it's exceptional or has particular win conditions, if it goes below 13 or 14 or in that area, you're going to have a hard time winning because a lot of what sealed is, even with all the repaid in AOA, a lot of what sealed is just keeping stuff on board for long enough to reap and then to gain all the amber from reaping and hopefully fight through any repaid you have and just race the opponent to the end, because there's not as much amber control in AOA. There's very little compared to Coda, compared to other sets. So that's the number of creatures is important. You sometimes will take a deck that has other better pieces, but has you sometimes reject a deck that has better pieces, but it doesn't have that many creatures, and you'll take a deck instead that has a lot of creatures, but not quite as many other pieces. It really kind of is a balancing test, and we'll get into some examples in a minute. The fourth thing I mentioned is amber generation, right? So amber generation obviously comes from things that are stapled on things, cards with amber pips on them on the play. Those are often very important in this format because if your opponents are playing decks that clear your board or can kill creatures, and your amber generation is all based off of reaping with creatures, then you can have a problem, right? You can have a situation where you're not really getting to those triggers a lot, and if you don't seize control of the board early and you lose control of the board, you may not be able to get it back. And if your entire win condition is based off of maintaining board control and you can't, you run into someone, for example, with a crazy rat deck that does a lot of nasty things, then you're just going to have a hard time. And I mentioned here Reap. Obviously, amber generation through Reap is one of the more common ways to get amber, but there are certain combos in the set. Like there's a Drummerknot, Ganger Chieftain. So you play Drummerknot, you play Ganger Chieftain, which readies Drummerknot. If there are no creatures on the board, Drummerknot will Reap, which will return Ganger Chieftain to hand. You'll play that again, and you do the whole thing like 6 times, and you get a bunch of amber. So that's a combo, and you have other stuff like that. And then the final consideration are things like, forgot to put key cheats on here. So things like combos, other combos that don't have anything to do with any of the stuff I've mentioned. So you can have, if you have crazy combos, something like Martian Generosity, Key Abduction. So you have Martian Generosity, lose all your amber, draw 2 cards for each amber you lost, and it's got an amber stapled on it, so it's worst case scenario, draw 2 cards, but usually usually very better than that. Whatever. I can't talk. It's much better. That's the word I'm looking for. It's much better than that. And then you have situations where if you have artifact control, that's great, because there are going to be some decks in this format that care a lot about artifacts. Most decks won't, but the decks that do, you'll definitely want to kill the artifacts. So if you happen to have a poltergeist or some sort of, even a snack lifter in some situations, but usually you want something that destroys an artifact. So like something like Destroy Them All, which destroys an artifact, a creature, and an upgrade. That can be very useful. And key cheats are no joke in this format. They can be very important, especially the new ones. Redacted is a little iffy. It's better in sealed because you're more likely to call houses like Logos if you have the right Logos cards. But this is all kind of an abstract consideration. So let's just go directly into looking at some examples. I'm going to pull this website back up. Okay. So this is Master Vault. I'm going to refresh Master Vault, and we're going to search by AOA, or filter by AOA, sorry, because we're going to do some AOA analysis here. So filter by AOA and search, and we'll just take the first few decks that come up. Master Vault's a little slow since the update, but okay, so we'll take these 3 decks and we'll look at them. All right, and we're doing this in the Master Vault and not like on decks of Keyforge, because you will not have access to that information on decks of Keyforge when you are analyzing. You'll just have deck lists. So let's do this. All right, so our first deck that we're analyzing is called Sire Jessa Lips, Brobner Sanctum Shadows. Okay. So, this is a very interesting deck. This is disgusting. I was joking with my friend the other day about how I keep getting just hornswoggled with all this stuff in Shadows when someone plays it too much to protect, and then I don't play around the second one, they show up with the second one. That's happened to me a couple times. But this deck, I don't know that I've seen one of these before. This deck has 4. 4. Too much to protect. Which is gross. I mean, well, hello. My cat has made an appearance. Would you like to come up here? Kira? Come up here? No. Alright, well, maybe she'll be joining us later. So there are 4 too much to protect in this deck. That's ridiculous and disgusting and all of the things. I've never seen 4 in any sort of sealed format. In terms of Amber Control, that's the first thing we look at is Amber Control. So you have Shadows. Shadows is got worse, in my opinion, and I think many other people's opinion. It got worse from Coda to AOA. However, it's still the best source of Amber Control. Yes, hello. All right, okay, come here. Okay, she wants to participate. So, all right. So you have Shadows. Oh, she wants to jump. There she goes. You have Dust Chronicles, which is okay. It does things, but it's not Amber Control. Gamgee is definitely a thing, right? So Gamgee says reap if your opponent has more than you steal 1. That's good Amber Control a lot of the time. Swindle is... I don't love this card. Other people like this card more than I do, but taking an entire turn off just to steal 3 is pretty bad in a lot of matchups. There are certainly situations where like you have to do that, or doing that is beneficial. What I really like to see a deck with Swindle have are things where you get additional triggers. So there's a creature called Redlock in Shadows, and Redlock says if you at the end of your turn, if you have not played a creature, you gain 1. So if you have a couple Redlocks on the board and then play this card, it's much better in my opinion, because then it turns into something like gain 5, take 3 away from your opponent, which is a very solid turn. But just stealing 3, while it's nice a lot of times, if it doesn't board develop, it's not helpful usually early game, and late game it's more of a Hail Mary play. So I'm not a huge fan of this card, but it definitely is Amber Control. Dusk Runner is fantastic. You stick it on any creature, and all of a sudden it reaps and it steals one. And the reap triggers the active all triggers if there are concurrently occurring triggers, so two triggers happening at the same time. The active player determines which trigger they want to go first. So if you stuck a Dusk Runner, for example, on a Gamgee here, what you would have is you could say, I want to trigger this ability on Gamgee first. So then if they had more, I'd steal one. And then after that, I would steal another one from Dusk Runner, as an example. Little Nifs are very good in the right deck, and I think this is actually going to be a great deck for Little Nif. So Little Nif says after a neighbor is used to fight, steal one, and that also importantly does not require the neighbor of Little Nif to survive the fight. So you could stick up a Brobner creature, a Sanctum creature. These are probably the two best houses for this next to this guy, and you could steal one even if the creature died and stick a different creature next to him. So Shadows, I actually think this is one or two too many, too much to protect. That's a mouthful, but the simple reason being that most of the time your opponent's not going to. I mean, it's kind of funny if the more of these you play, the more likely your opponent is going to believe that you don't have another one, because they don't get to see your deck list and sealed. So if you played one of these, they're gonna, all right, fine. You play two of these, they're gonna be like, I mean, that's really frustrating, but I can't play around two. You play the third one of these in one game, it's going to be a big impact because they will not be playing around that. And the fourth one is just murder. Like you just kill the opponent basically. And I could see a lot of scenarios playing this deck where I mean, you usually never want to hold this card anyway, just like any other card. But you play the card early for effect. You play like one or two of these early in a game when you're like, well, I just got to play this for Amber, right? And then they're like, oh, they've dumped too much to protect out of their hand. They've gotten really unlucky with how they drew the card. It wasn't useful. I have no problem running up to like 15 Amber. Then you're like, surprise, here's number 3. And they're like, okay, fine, that's insane. But surely they don't have a fourth one. And then you drop a fourth one on them. So you can do some stupid things with this deck in Shadows. In Sanctum, Obey the Grim is one of the better Sanctum cards in terms of Amber control. So you capture 3, and then you reap to discard 1. And again, you stick something like, you could stick, this guy wants to reap a lot, so you can stick a Dusk Runner on him. So you have 2 of those guys, that's very good. Then you have Borden the Redeemed, that's just capture 2 as an action. You have 2 of those. Child the Safeguard, you have a Protect the Weak to stick to protect, like, I don't know, Gamgees or something. Sir Marrow's just a static ability that allows you to take all the amber that they get from reaping. The Grey Rider is very good. The Grey Rider is good. The Grey Rider is great in this deck because you have things like Little Nif. So if you stick like Little Nif, a big creature like Chow or something like that, and then the Grey Rider next to Chow, and you fight with Chow, and then you reap with the Grey Rider to allow you to fight with Chow again, and it's next to a Little Nif, you steal 2. Like, this deck is really good, and I haven't even got to Brobner yet. You have Free Markets, which is always a good card because you're rarely going to be hitting for less than 3 on this. Sometimes 2, but sometimes 4 or 5. So that's just really good. Unifier is also really good if you have enough creatures in the deck. There aren't a lot of Shadows creatures. You only got 1, 2, 3, 4 Shadows creatures, so that's a little bit harder to hit there. But they're Shadows creatures you want to stay alive. So, Unifier. This is a creature control card that's very good. There's a lot of big stuff in the set. And then you have Sanctum Guardian, which is another taunter. So the Sanctum set is really good. It's got a lot of Amber control. Like, even if you didn't have Shadows at all, this could be considered a good Amber control set. 2 Bordens, 2 Obeyeds. It'd be a decent Amber control set. So if you look at Brobnar, man, okay. So you have a Gauntlet, which right away is great, because Gauntlet works fantastic with things like Little Nif. So you stick something next to Little Nif, and then you Gauntlet it continuously. In terms of things you would want to Gauntlet, so you have Lollop, which is great, a great Gauntlet target most of the time. You have 2 Pounds, so these are the direct damage I was referring to earlier, or an example of the direct damage. So this is really good. 1/2 Punch stuns an enemy creature, or if it was already stunned, kill it, which is great if you had like a Tremor as combo where you have 2 of them. You don't, but that's okay. And then you have things that, like Grok, you even have Amber Control and Brobnar. Like, Grok with a Gauntlet is great. It's even better if they have elusive creatures. You just swing in there and make them lose stuff. And then Bramo just blows stuff up on play. You have a War Grumpus, which is alright. And then you have the Bellowing Patri. I have no shot. No shot. But this is a one-way. So this is a one-way. I'm forgetting the name. Pingle Huanoise. Actually, Pingle Huanoise is only one way. So this is kind of a Pingle Huanoise when it's untapped, when it enters play. So unless your opponent exhausts this for some reason, all of the time, it's going to be dealing 1 damage to all your opponent's creatures. The one downside is it's going to be dealing damage to your creatures on the play. So things like Gamgee and Little Nif come in with 1 damage, but you don't have any 1 power creatures, so it won't actually kill anything. It'll just drop a damage on these things, which isn't that bad. And then all of your Sanctum stuff all has armor, or most of it does. Borden doesn't, but Shal does, Aubade does, Cermeros does, the Grey Rider does not, so you take a damage on that. But again, just 1. Unifier does, and the Guardian does. So they all take 1 damage when they're coming into play, but you have armor, so you don't really care. So this is, I mean, we've spent a lot of time talking about this, but this is, in my opinion, a fantastic deck for Sealed. I mean, it's not like the best I've ever seen, but it is very good. I would expect that if I played this deck, there'd be a reasonable chance I could win the vault. If I open something like this, you have Amber Control in all 3 houses. You have, let's count creatures: 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, geez, 18, 19, 20, 21. 21 creatures is an enormous amount, and you have all this stuff. Yeah, I would expect that there's a very good shot this deck could win a Vault Tour. You need to get lucky. You always need to get lucky to win a Vault Tour, but it's pretty good. And this, like, there are some matchups where these four too much to protect. There are some matchups where that will not do much. There are even some matches where you may not steal any. But if it's not stealing any, you're probably just straight up winning the matchup. But there are definitely going to be some matchups where they're just running an Amber Rush deck, and this will absolutely destroy them. This will be the end of them. And by the third one, they'll just be... yes, it'll be death. So, that's deck 1. Deck 1 was very good. Decks 2 and 3 have a lot to live up to if they have any shot. So let's go to deck 2. Deck 2 is Ursula, Crucible Mayor. Okay, right away, I love this title. I don't know how good it's going to be, but I love it. We started at the right last time. Let's start here. We're going to start with Brobnar. So, looking at Brobnar, a couple things I noticed. First of all, 2 Lollips is very good in terms of fighting. Burn the Stockpile is one of the better Amber Control cards that Brobnar has. Lighting 4 Amber on fire is always good, although the 7 or more criteria means that they could have 6, 7, 8, or 9, and this card takes them off check unless there's something that decreases key cost. That is extremely good. That's very rare that you would have a card that would do that. Because compare this with Cutthroat Research, which we said before, and actually this deck has. Cutthroat Research never takes someone off check by themselves unless you would have to combine it with some other steal, capture, or something that increases key cost. So Cutthroat Research itself never takes anyone off check. Just never does it. But Burn the Stockpile does a lot. It takes them off check a lot. So that Burn the Stockpile is very good, especially in Sealed. Calfine, Grok again, Amber Control, into the fray, 2 Lollips, a pound, the burn we talked about, Flamewake, Grump Buggy. The Grump Buggy, okay, so Grump Buggy is a good card in the right decks. You want to have Grump Buggy with a lot of big Brobnar creatures. Grump Buggy says you have to have power 5 or more to increase key costs. And there are a lot of decks, if you play this against, it just basically doubles the cost of their key and does very little to yours. And when you have that sort of matchup, it is a massive card. And stuff like this, by the way, is why you would like to have artifact control that kills artifacts. But again, that's a luxury. You're not going to pick decks on that basis unless they are nearly identical. But that rarely is the case. So you have Grump Buggy. Let's see. Lollop. Grok is 5, Calfine is 5. So you have 4 right there that are bigger. Bingham Avalanche is also bigger. This is a super good card, especially if you had a way to key cheat, which doesn't look like you do in here. But it's still very good, because you just basically deal a whole bunch of damage to their board and him before you key. Barehanded is a reasonable answer to artifacts. It's not great in this deck because you have... actually, it might be okay in this deck. Hold on, I thought you had more artifacts. So the Grunt Buggy is 1. Proclamation, we'll come back to that. That's a super good card. And the Gorm, which kills artifacts. So you don't really care. If they had an artifact to kill, you would kill it before you'd put it on top of your library. So that's fine. Yeah, I guess Barehanded is pretty good in this deck. The only downside is that if you don't want to pop your Grunt Buggy, then you don't want to do that. And Sound the Horns just fetches a Brobnar creature, which is good. So Brobnar's solid. Not spectacular, but solid, and it's a good Grunt Buggy deck. Actually, while I'm on the subject of Grunt Buggy, let me skip Logos. We'll come back to Logos. Let's go to Sanctum. So it's got Obeyed. We talked about how good that is earlier. It's got Chow. 2 Chows. It's got Blinding Light, Hallowed Shield, Surmeros again, the Grey Rider again, Free Markets again, 2 Gorms. Gorms are premium artifact control in this set because they kill things. It doesn't just it's not remote access, so it doesn't just use it, it kills things. Mother Nortel is something that Mother Nortel is something that helps you move stuff off Obeyed, but you're not capturing a lot in this deck other than Obeyed. So, because these things don't capture, Blinding Light doesn't, none of these other things capture. So Mother Nortel is basically, her ability is basically only useful to accelerate Obeyed's, discarding or moving stuff to their, getting rid of the captured Amber. So I don't love Mother Nortel in this deck. It's usually just a 2-power creature with Elusive, which is fine, but still not spectacular. Proclamation is a great card. Because the reason it's a great card is because by the time you pass back to your opponent, you will almost always have a shot at eliminating 1 house from their board in terms of creatures. So almost always this is going to be in play unless they have a gargantuan board and you probably already lost, or there's some sort of effect in play and you got the wrong cards. But I would say well over half the time when you have this card in play, if you want it to be online, it will be online. You'll have a chance to put it online, and by online I mean have a chance for its effect to be active. So I like Proclamation a lot. It is very good, and it is only one-sided, right? It's only the opponent. So Proclamation is very good Amber control in that it bumps up the cost of their keys. All right, let's talk Logos. So in Logos, you want to see generally a lot of archiving. This Logos is not very good, and let me explain why. Binate Rupture is a fine card when it's combined with other things. So something like Binate Rupture, Interdimensional Graft, that's commonly called a Brig combo, because you double their Amber and then you take all the Amber they forge, take the excess Amber when they forge the next turn. So that is, that's a good combo. On its own, you rarely are going to be playing Binate Rupture, because you don't really want to be putting, if your opponent already is in check, you don't generally want to be doubling their Amber. If they're not in check and you're going to put them in check by playing this card, it's frequently horrendous. So a lot of the time you're going to be discarding Binate Rupture. And we talked about Cutthroat Research. So Cutthroat Research is fine. You're always going to play it because it's always for an Amber. But it's rarely going to hit. I've said rarely. Yeah, I think it hits a lot less than 25% of the time. Maybe 10, 15 if I had to guess. So usually this is just play a card, get an Amber, which isn't the worst thing in the world, but it's not very good. Pip is fine if you can protect it. And you do have things that can protect it, right? You have a couple Chows, so you can protect Pip. And it's one-sided. We talked about that earlier. One-sided Repaint is solid, so that's a thing that matters. So I would consider that a good card. Sutterkin is great. If you have a Logos house with multiple creatures in it, and even one Sutterkin, it's fantastic. You have 2, and you have Rocket Boots. So if you could somehow manage to play a Professor Sutterkin and some other, like Helper Bot is great because it'll let you house cheat. So let me come back to that for a second. I'm talking about Sutterkin. I don't want to get sidetracked. Sutterkin in this deck has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Logos creatures, which is just enough for it to be occasionally very good. You play a Professor Sutterkin, and you have Rocket Boots. So you play Professor Sutterkin, maybe 2 of them, drop 1 or 2 more Logos creatures, and then pass turn. The other thing you could do is you could play Professor Sutterkin and only have maybe 1 of the Logos creatures on the board, but these don't have to be, it does not say ready, right? So it draws a card for each friendly Logos creature. So a common play pattern when you have a Sutterkin deck is to play Sutterkin, play maybe one other creature, have Sutterkin on board. They look at him, they know he's a problem, but he's not an imminent threat because you don't have that many Logos creatures. So they decide to do something else with their turn and don't kill Sutterkin. Then the next turn you drop like creature, 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 and then even if you just reap with Sutterkin at that point, that's 5. But if you drop Rocket Boots on Sutterkin and you reap twice and draw 10 cards, that frequently just turns the entire game because you end up with like your entire deck in hand. Helperbot is also good here, and I started talking about this earlier, but to come back to it, Helperbot is very good here. The one saving grace of the Ruptures is if you had a Binate Rupture in hand, and you had something like Binate Rupture, Helperbot, and access to a Burn the Stockpile. So if they're sitting at like 4, for example, and you Rupture, then Helperbot, then Burn the Stockpile, you double your Amber, and if they were at 4, they don't, they have net 0 change. So that specific scenario can be good, and you can also put Burn the Stockpile under something like Jargogle. So even if you don't have the Helper Bot in play or the Rupture handy, you could still put that under Jargogle so that you have and remember you have the ability of when to use it, so you can swing Jargogle into something and sack him and burn the stockpile during your turn. So the Sutterkins raised this from probably a not great Logos house to I think I misspoke earlier. I think this is maybe slightly above average. I really like Sutterkins and Rocket Boots. It's super good. Martinologist is great in some matchups. If they have Mars creatures, it's amazing because you don't have Mars creatures. Otherwise, it's just a 2-power elusive, just like Mother Nortel. So again, I think that there are going to be a lot of, to summarize this deck, there are a lot of pools where this deck will be the best deck that you have. Because you have a bunch of creatures, you have some Amber Control, like you have Burn, you have, these are, like I said, not really Amber Control, they're kind of Amber Control. And then you have, Rupture into Burn. And you have an Obeyed, but you really don't have that much Amber Control. So even if the first deck we looked at was overall quality about the same as this, it would be a far, far leader right now because of the Amber Control in the deck. For sure, a far, far leader over this deck. Even though this deck has some fun things, and it's pretty good, I think. But this deck that we looked at first is way better. With an entire Shadows House of Amber Control, this is gross. Obeyed, all this other stuff. Let's look at deck number 3. Deck number 3 is Bomblight, Hail Plankaka Recluse. I don't understand how you pronounce that, but whatever. It's called Bomblight. So, here's what Bomblight has. Alright. Water break. I'm going to look at this for a minute, and I'll let you, the viewer, look at this for a minute, and then I'll tell you what I think, and you can see if your opinions are different, the same. So we'll give you a minute. Read this deck. Oh, and I'm sorry. I have not been paying attention. I apologize if I've been burying the first house under my name. This is Dis, obviously. I'm just going to put the picture right here. So, here's the house. Okay. So here are some thoughts. Let's talk about Dis. So Banish is creature removal, but in my opinion, it's not very good. There are some situations where you have like a creature that has a lot of amber on it that's captured, or that has an upgrade on it that's really good, where banishing that creature is going to be just as good as killing it, or very close to as good as killing it. But most of the time, banishing a creature, especially if it has like an on the play ability, is going to be somewhere between okay to bad. Because if they can just call, if it's got a play ability like Professor ZYX, where he plays and archives the top card of your library, or the top card of your discard pile. Banishing that guy is bad. It's affirmatively bad because they pick him up and they get another playability. But even a solid creature without a playability, something like Shockworm, banishing Shockworm is pretty good because Shockworm's the thing that doesn't allow you to reap. Or, sorry, it says if you reap, you stun your creatures. So banishing Shockworm and then reaping with a bunch of Dis stuff is fine. That's probably a bit above average, but banishing just something normal, like banishing on Obeyed the Grim, is okay, but then they could just replay Obeyed, especially if Obeyed had fewer than 3 amber on it. Banishing an Obeyed can often be counterproductive. It's a stall tactic usually. So I don't love Banish. I talked a lot about Banish, but I don't love Banish. Call the Weak is different. I love Call the Weak. You can manipulate their board until the least powerful creature is the thing you want to kill a lot of times, and then kill that thing. And it's very straightforward. Dust Imps are great. I love Dust Imps. They are threats on a stick, but they're threats to Amber Gen. So, Amber Generation. So if you just play them, and then if you kill all the creatures, which we have a way to do, we'll talk about that in a second, or even if you just play them and they're there and they can just keep reaping, and then eventually your opponent will have to kill them, or will think about killing them, and then they'll have to give you 2 amber when they kill them. And if they kill them on your, if they kill them, meaning if they die on their turn, then they will have a situation where they'll be handing you amber, and they may be putting you in check, so they may not be able to kill them without risking that. So Dust Imps, I think, are very good, especially in sealed. Exhume, super good card. Like there are few cards in Dis that I like more than Exhume, especially in this format, because there are so many things that you're going to want to exhume. Like, jumping ahead just a moment, this Shockworm. We talked a lot about the Shockworm. If the Shockworm is in your graveyard, the fact that you can play the Shockworm on a Dis turn is exceptional, because the Shockworm has a static effect that hurts the enemy, and all you need to do is get him into play. You don't need to reap with him. You don't need to do anything with him. He doesn't need to be active. You just need to get that guy into play. So exhuming a Shockworm is amazing. You also have a Lash. Lash is one of the best constant amber control abilities, where you can use Lash when you call Dis. One thing I'll say about Lash is that a lot of people like Lash because it takes people off check, and it's good for that, for sure. But one of the things that's fantastic about Lash is when you use it, even when you know they're going to forge, but making them pay 3 extra amber to forge is often as good, or sometimes even better, than holding them off check, like lashing when they're at 7, so they can't forge that turn, but then the next turn you have to call something other than Dis, and then they forge at 6 and then still have that other left over amber, is frequently not as good as saying, okay, you have 10, I will lash, so you have to pay almost all that amber in order to forge a key, especially if it's like their first key. It's very good. So Lash is a very good card. Misery Exploit is great if you have a deck that deals a lot of damage. So we'll come back to that and we'll see if that's a thing that we're going to do. Not Finished With You is very good if you have something like Unlock Gateway. So Unlock Gateway in this deck is a board clear. I'm trying to remember. I don't think we had any other board clears in the previous 2 decks, which is one of the major knocks against them. Not enough not to pick them, but certainly a knock against them. But Unlock Gateway is very good, especially when it's combined with things like Soul Snatcher. This can be a very swingy card. Right? Some matchups you don't play this card, but if you have a lot of creatures on board, typically Unlock Gateway, if you have a lot of creatures on board, you don't want to... If you have more creatures, you frequently don't want to kill all of the creatures if you would lose a bunch of creatures and board advantage. However, when you have creatures like Dust Imp, which give you 2 for killing them, and you have a Soul Snatcher. Soul Snatcher is basically like life insurance for your creatures, right? So if you have a board advantage, but they have creatures on board that you don't have the ability to kill any other way, um, you face these hard decisions on whether to gateway, whether not to gateway. If you have, say, like 8 creatures on board and they have 3, but the 3 are really problematic, it feels a lot better to gateway off those 3 creatures if you have a Soul Snatcher in play, because you are then gaining 8 amber for the gateway, and the gateway becomes a fantastic card rather than just a somewhat good card in that situation. Schuler is good. It's amber control. Play it, steal 1. Straightforward. Big creature. Does things. All right. So the disc is pretty good. The gateway makes this disc pretty good, I think. Especially since you have 1, 2 pieces of amber control in disc, which is not that common, plus you have a Soul Snatcher gateway. Okay. Collector Worm. Collector Worm is an amazing card. Collector Worm fights almost anything in the set and just eats it. It just archives it, and the important thing, the one thing I would say is you want to be very careful not to have what Decks of Keyforge calls anti-synergies. You don't want to have a situation where you have a deck where you rely a lot on the archive. Say you had, instead of Dis, you had Logos in here, and you were relying a lot on the archive, and you would need to put things in and take things out of your archive, like you had Eureka, and you had the ZYX crew, as it were, and you're putting a lot of stuff in your archive. If you are also running Collector Worms, you're going to face hard choices where you have a lot of cards in your archive, or even some cards in your archive that you want to take, but you know that doing so is going to give the opponent creatures that you deemed good enough to pull off the board. That's a hard call a lot of the time, and you're usually going to be very hesitant to do that. But this is not one of those decks, right? This is not a deck with Logos. It's not a deck where you're going to be archiving a lot of stuff. It doesn't have a library in Dis that archives stuff. So you're not archiving a lot of your own stuff. So keeping the archive kind of like as a jail for the opponent's creatures, if you can just keep it as a jail, is great, right? You usually want either Logos, a bunch of archiving Logos stuff, or the Marzi steal stuff, put your opponent's stuff into archive. So it's one or the other. Because in this deck, you're basically never pulling your archive. So you have 2 Collector Worms, which is great. You have a Mars First, which is always good. It's like a Squawker, but you can't stun anything. The Beam Buckler is always useful. Sometimes it's amazing. Sometimes it kills Tesmal, all other sorts of 2 damage stuff. But moving stuff to a flank is absolutely a thing. If you could move, like, the Untamed decks that have the Panapaka, or however you pronounce that, the stuff that says all the creatures to the left of the battle line have some effect, or all the creatures to the right of the battle line have some effect. Dealing 2 damage to those creatures is not usually going to kill them, but dealing 2 damage and shifting the whole battle line, like moving that to the far end of the battle line and stripping all the bonuses from the entire battle line, is often a major play. So Beam Buckler does a lot of work in certain matchups, and even when it doesn't do work, the only time when it's going to be bad is when you're the only person with creatures on board, and then you got to deal damage to one of your creatures. But again, it's still very good most of the time. Thinkdrome got better in this set, in my opinion. So Thinkdrome, you can archive things like, let's say you needed to move something on their board. You can use Thinkdrome and Reap and archive Beam Buckler because it's got a play effect. There are other things you can archive too, but that's pretty good. Shockworm is great. It's just fantastic. It is strong deterrent / stall for the opponent. It does work. Combat Pheromones is useful. Not amazing, but fine. You can use 2 creatures on your turn. Exterminate is a conditional card. You have to be very careful about Exterminate because you have to. If you have targets, you have to use them. So if you had creatures, let's say you had a Mars creatures that were like 7, 8, and 9 in power. That's not realistic, but it makes the example easier. You have a 7, 8, 9 Mars creatures, and your opponent has 2 and 3 non-Mars creatures, and you have a 1 non-Mars creature. If you, all power, of course. If you play this card, you have to kill your non-Mars creature, because you would have to kill their 2, and then you would have another target, and you have to pick your creature. So it can be double-sided, but it's still pretty good in this deck. It's especially good when you have things like Dust Imps, because a lot of times killing a dust imp on your side is going to be more profitable than killing a random 2 creature over there that's not doing anything. All right. So Spike is very, very good if you can find a way to kill everything not on a flank. So the best use for Spike in this deck is going to be something like you play Unlock Gateway at the end of your turn. You kill a bunch of stuff. They take their turn. They play 4 creatures. You call Mars the next turn. The first thing you do is play Spike and you kill the middle 2 creatures. Like, that's a great use for Spike. Red Planet Raygun is good if you have creatures. How many creatures do you have in Mars? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. You have 6. So Red Planet Raygun is great, because Red Planet Raygun will deal probably on average 3 in this deck, maybe even more. And it's one-sided. It's not a fight, just deals damage. So you could put it on something like Zorg is pretty good. You could put it on like a Shockworm. You're not fighting with Shockworm a lot, so putting Red Planet Raygun on a Shockworm is usually pretty good, although Shockworm is already a target, so you don't always want to put it there because it just makes it even more of a target. You could put on something like Think Drome. Think Drome is not super threatening, but you want to diversify your threats so that they can't, cripple you by just killing 1 creature. That's important. Extinction is interesting. So Extinction is something that can be amazing if you have a very different matchup. Like if your opponent is playing a bunch of Niffle stuff. And like if they're Untamed and they have like a Niffle Queen or something weird, right? Like, and you play Extinction and you target a creature that's only Niffle, or like Niffle and an Ape, and you don't have any of those. It's amazing. But there are some times where it gets you into these very weird decisions, like if you have to target a human, and you end up killing half your Sanctum lineup that's on the board as a result. So it's sometimes great, sometimes below average removal, but it's still removal. It's definitely a thing. The Sanctum House. You have 2 Hallowed Shields, which, if they were Omni, in my opinion, they'd be really good. But because they're actions, you have to call Sanctum. So they're still fine, but they're not great. Chow is pretty good. It taunts, it deploys, it protects, it does stuff. Lion is another one. Just pumps up your creatures, which is fine. Abon the Armorsmith, again, you have a lot of like board protection-y type stuff in here that gives armor. Take Hostages is great if you have stuff that you can fight with. So do we have stuff that we can fight with? The Grey Rider causes fighting, so that's fine. Like, you wouldn't mind fighting with like a Schuler or a Gub. You're not usually going to fight with Gub. You wouldn't hate that. Collector Worm, I'll tell you, is the target, though. So if you stick a Grey Rider next to a Collector Worm and you go like Hallowed Shield on the Collector Worm, Reap Grey Rider, fight with the Collector Worm, take a creature, Collector Worm takes no damage. So you could fight into like huge things. You could fight into a Dominator in that scenario and you would just take it and nothing would happen. So that's very good. A Disambassador in this case, Ambassadors are almost always good. This Disambassador is very good, I think, for a couple reasons. One, the targets for your Disambassador stuff are very good. Like, you could, like, Disambassador Lash is a thing. Like, it's absolutely a thing. Disambassador Exhume is great. Disambassador, even Banish would be fine, but Call the Weak, drop a Dust Imp on Disambassador. Even if you have to, you can Disambassador into Gateway. I think that's fine. Potion of Invulnerability is good. I think it's good in this deck, especially since you have stuff that wants to fight. It's not amazing, but it's still good. Stuff like Collector Worms with the Potion of Invulnerability is very good. Just all sorts of stuff that you can fight into. Rothus the Fierce is, in my opinion, one of the best protectors in the game. Hazardous 4 makes it so a lot of stuff that would attack this card just can't. It just can't attack the card because it instantly dies. So Rothus the Fierce is really good, in my opinion, to protect things. Like, you put that next to a Collector Worm, it'd be great. You put that next to a Shock Worm, it'd be great. Just a lot of stuff it protects. It's very good, in my opinion. The Hazardous 4 is a house. So Begone is interesting. Begone is destroy each disc creature or gain 1. Now, ideally, you would want to have this in a deck that doesn't have dis. I will say that it is better it is better than an average deck that also has dis in this deck. And the reason why is because of the Dust Imps, right? That want to be destroyed. So if you played Begone when you had Dust Imps on board, it does some serious work. So I think that it's not terrible. It always gets you at least an Amber, but some of the time you're going to be killing a Gub, a Schuler. Actually, that's it. Those are the only creatures you don't want to kill. Yeah, no, that's pretty good. And if they have Dis, it's very good. Obviously, if they don't have Dis, then you just are going to make a decision on whether you want to kill your stuff, but that's pretty good. This deck is solid. We opened 3. We didn't open any stinkers, in my opinion. We opened air quotes, 3 good decks here. But I think that even though there's fun stuff in here, even though I like the Dust Imps, I like the Disc House, I like all this stuff, I don't know how I turn this deck down. I can't. And I got to tell you, this is not in any way the main reason I would take a deck, but the first 3 rounds you play with this, like, Word would spread. I mean, this is the one downside to playing a deck with this much shock value, with a 4 too much to protect, is that Word would spread throughout the room that there's a guy in the room that has a 4 too much to protect deck. So the first time, even if your opponent didn't know who it was, the first time they played you and you dropped the too much to protect, they would be like, oh, are you the guy that has 4, right? So, I mean, that's the one downside to this in a sealed environment, that people would know what you're running. But again, what are you going to do? I mean, you could constantly play around too much to protect, and then stuff like Little Nif hits you. Yeah, this would be the deck I would take. It's got 21 creatures, if I recall correctly. It's got Amber Control in all houses. It's got good board control. It's got all sorts of stuff. So, sometimes I do this thing, and again, Decks of Keyforge is a great site. I have nothing but good things to say about it. It's not ultimately the only thing you would look at, even if you could look at the scores before you decided, it's not the best thing you would look at, but it is still useful to kind of verify my thoughts. So, but I like sticking decks in, so I'm going to stick this deck in here and see what the score is. Okay. So, Instincts confirmed, right? An 89 Assassin sealed is really, really good. 24E is super fast, as we expected. That's expected Amber. 15.5A is unheard of in AOA sealed. I mean, like, unheard of that there would be 15.5A. 7.5 creatures. Like I said, this deck, and again, numbers are just numbers. It's all about the analysis. That's why we went through the analysis in the first place. This deck absolutely could win a vault, unless it ran into a really bad matchup or drew incredibly poorly. But this is a very gross deck. I mean, this deck is borderline Archon competitive. I don't think it is because it doesn't have any artifact control, and it's did I say it's fast earlier? I shouldn't have said that. It rushes. It generates Amber, but it's not. The 1D means it's not that fast in going through the deck. So it's probably not quick enough to be Archon competitive, but it's a very good deck. Alright, so here, let's do this, and then we'll import the other decks. I think, my guess is that the Crucible Mayor, which one do I think this one's going to be better. Or Decks of Keyforge will think this deck is better. So we'll import number 3. Yeah. So, again, there's things in here. But this, and it has about the same amount of expected Amber, but the Amber controls so much less, right? And we knew that from the beginning. We knew that going in. So this gives you a good illustration of the difference. And the difference doesn't feel that stark when you're not looking at a summary, but it's pretty distinct. The first one is Ursula. So let's do that. So I can bounce back and forth between them. Okay, so it thinks Ursula is slightly more valuable cards, but slightly less Arc. Arc is a combination of... I did a video on Arc somewhere else that's on my channel, so feel free to take a look at that for a refresher. But here, the nice thing about this is, like we noted, it does have artifact control. It has a moderate amount of Amber control. 7.5A is not terrible in terms of Amber control for AOA sealed, but if you're given a choice to have more than double of that, like, if this is your alternative, this is gross. Like, I would look at all the decks, I would take my time, but frankly, I saw this deck, and you saw my reaction. Like, it was there. Like, this has all the pieces. The only thing it didn't have is artifact control, so if you ran into an artifact problem, you got a problem. But it's got so much stuff. Sire Jessa Lips. 100% the correct choice.